So it was hunting season, and I had only been living in this small mountain town for about 9 months now. I was eager to get out there and get hunting, so I started asking the locals for tips on hunting spots and leases. They all warned me about one place, though. It was Baxter's Mountain. They said to stay away, that it was a bad place. It was haunted in some way. Bad things happened there. And some people that went there, they never came back the same. Some of them never came back at all. Whenever I asked what was happening up there, why it was as it is, nobody would give me a straight answer. They were all the same. All I would get was a scared look and a quick change of subject. See, I worked in the oil and gas industry, so I was out on the countryside a lot. I'd been to Baxter's Mountain a few times for work now, but nothing weird ever happened. I never seen anything strange. But still, I always had that strange feeling like I was being watched. But I chalked it up to the stories that I've heard. That all changed, though, one foggy, cold morning when I was walking the gas line, checking for leaks. The fog was thick, almost suffocating, and the cold clung to everything like an unshakable weight. I was about 2 miles in when I heard it. Footsteps, the sound of crunching leaves. I stopped, listened, and sure enough, they stopped too. The silence that followed felt unnatural, almost suffocating. It went on like that for what felt like forever, and the more it happened, the more my heart started to race. Finally, I hollered out, thinking it was just an animal. But then came the sound of trees snapping, something crashing through the woods, loud, close, and wrong. The air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't quite place. I couldn't see anything through the dense fog. That's when the fear hit me like a hammer, and I ran fast back to my truck. But just as I reached it, I heard it again. This time, the most horrific scream I've ever heard. It sounded so wrong, like some kind of demon or creature, something beyond the realm of nature. I floored that truck and got out of there, and I never looked back. Later that day at the shop, I told my boss what had happened. He laughed it off, said I'd just gotten worked up, listening to all the local stories. Probably just a mountain lion or a bobcat, he said. But I knew better. I spent enough time in the woods to know that wasn't any cat. He sent me back the next day to finish the job. I dreaded it. The weather was beautiful, sunny, but I couldn't shake that feeling. The feeling of being watched, and something else was out there. As I was finishing the line check, about 4 miles in, I heard those footsteps again. My heart skipped a beat. I yelled, then something came crashing through the woods. I braced myself for whatever it was, but when it finally emerged from the brush, it was the biggest white-tailed buck I've ever seen. I couldn't believe it. My fear turned into excitement. The sheer size of that white-tailed buck had me thinking this was the place to hunt. When I got back to the shop, I was telling my boss about it. He said no one hunts on Baxter's Mountain because of all those stories. So that's where all the big game hides. They live there, knowing they're safe. That's when I decided I had to find the landowner and get permission to hunt there. As I was searching, everyone told me the owner was crazy, meaner than mean, and not to go there. His son had gone missing up there on Baxter's Mountain 15 years ago while riding his quad. The search parties found the quad, but no trace of him. It was like he just vanished. But none of that mattered to me at the moment. All I could think about was that monster buck that I had seen. Finally, I tracked down the old farmer, the man that owned the leases on the mountain. I drove out to his place that day. The long, winding road led me to a run-down farm, cluttered with rusted machinery and the fields overgrown. The house looked ancient, like it had been standing since the town was founded. The smell of decay hit me as soon as I got out of the truck, like the land had been abandoned long ago. But I needed that permission. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Then, from the barn, I heard a voice holler at me. "Who the hell are you?" I froze. As I spun around, it was the old farmer, and he had a shotgun. And the closer he got, the more nervous I became. I explained I was working on the pipeline and had seen some things up on the mountain. But before I could finish, he interrupted, his voice rising with anger. "What did you see?" he shouted. "You shouldn't be up there. I've warned you all before. It took my son, you know." I tried to explain, but he wasn't listening. He kept waving the shotgun around, getting more and more worked up. Then he pointed it right at me and told me to get off his property. My heart pounding in my chest, I apologized and said I didn't mean to bring up bad memories. I just wanted his permission to hunt on his lease. Then I made a mistake. I had mentioned his wife, out of habit, as I deal with so many customers about their land leases. And that set him off. His face went red, and he screamed, "My wife? You know nothing about her." The rage in his eyes was terrifying. I started slowly backing up, but before I knew it, I was flat on my back, tripping over what looked like half a coyote carcass. And there he was, standing over me, shotgun aimed directly at my chest, his breath heavy and enraged. He said in a deep, angry voice, "How dare you speak of my wife? You know nothing. You're new here, aren't you, boy? I tell you, that mountain is evil. He took everything away from me. My wife, well, she just stood by and..." Then he stopped speaking, and his anger and his face turned to a hellish grin, and he started this eerie, gut-wrenching, deep laughing. It sent chills down my spine. "You want to go up there?" he asked, his voice low and dark. "You go right ahead, but know this, when you come across him, you've been warned." I scrambled to my feet, shaking, and got the hell out of there. As I drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about what he had said about the mountain. And then, out of nowhere, there it was, that giant buck. It crossed the road right in front of my truck. And all I could think of was, I have permission to hunt that buck of a lifetime. All the stories, the experience I just went through with the crazy old man, washed away out of my head. And yes, I had buck fever. The next morning at the shop, I was telling my boss about yesterday, that I had gone out to visit the old man to try and get permission. He just shook his head, kind of laughed. He said, "See, I told you that old man was crazy. You should stay away from there. Nothing good comes from that place. You don't know what that old guy's capable of." I assured him that I wasn't ever going back there, not after what had happened. As the weeks passed, I finally got the chance to hunt again. It was snowing heavily, and my boss had told me to take the day off. So, I packed my truck up, and I headed out to Baxter's mountain, hoping to see that big buck one more time. The animals were moving around a lot for a snowy day, which I felt strange, as they normally bed down in storms. As I arrived to the bottom of the mountain to the lease road, I parked my truck by the gate as I didn't want to spook anything off, and I decided to grab my rifle and my gear and walk the lease roads for the day in search of that buck of a lifetime. Throughout the day, I'd seen lots of deer, lots of tracks, lots of movement, but I never saw the one that I'd been searching for. It was starting to get late in the day. Dusk was coming, and I wanted to head back to the truck before night fell. As I was just about out to the truck, I spotted him. There he was, about 100 yards in front of me. He stood on the fence line like a king. The biggest buck I've ever seen, standing there, broadside, giving me the perfect shot. I squeezed the trigger. I knew that I'd hit him. He jumped the fence and into the thick bush. I walked up, but by the time I got up there, I went to see his tracks, to follow him, but I found something else. Huge tracks, fresh ones, and they were nothing like I'd ever seen before. They didn't belong to anything that I knew of. Something was out there with me. The hairs on my neck stood up. The air felt thicker, heavier, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. I loaded my rifle again and moved faster. After seeing these tracks, I didn't want to be there alone, and I knew I needed help anyways to drag this deer out through that thick bush. So I was desperate to get back to my truck. That feeling that something was there, not being alone, it had freaked me out. I made it to the truck, called my buddy Tom for help, and when I told him where I was, he went silent. "You're really up there?" he asked. When I said yes, he told me to leave, that something wasn't right with that place. But I was determined to get that buck. I managed to convince Tom, after a long chat, that I needed help and we couldn't just leave him. So it wasn't long before I saw my friend's truck pull up. But then, the feeling of being watched was overpowering. I was about to find out that there was something more than just the wildlife watching me up there. Tom jumped out of the truck. I was excited to tell him about the deer. Explaining where it had entered the woods, Tom followed me, and we both noticed how thick the woods were, how even with a flashlight the darkness swallowed everything. It was like we were walking into something else, something ancient. Tom just shook his head and said, "Okay, let's go in and get this buck so we can get out of here." So in we went. When we got to the deer, Tom was amazed at its size. He was almost as excited as I was. We tried to drag it out, but it was just too heavy, especially with the terrain forcing us to be on our knees. The trees seemed to close in around us as we field dressed the deer right there in the woods. The woods were so thick we couldn't barely move. The snow fell harder now. A blinding flurry of white. The silence was unnatural. It felt like the world had gone on mute. That's when it happened. The most eerie, ungodly, deep growl-like noise. It sounded like it was right there on top of us. We froze, shining the light all around us, but couldn't see anything beyond a couple of feet. The hairs on my neck prickled. We looked at each other, but didn't say a word. We continued about our business as if nothing happened. That is, until it happened again, this time louder and closer, like it was right there with us. I said, "Tom, did you hear that?" He nodded, shining the light around but still couldn't see anything. Then once again, the deepest, most terrifying growl I've ever heard echoed through the trees. At that moment I reached for my rifle, but in my excitement, I realized I had forgotten it at the truck. I told Tom. His reply was, "What?" And then it growled again, deeper, more gravelly, and it lasted for what felt like an eternity. My blood ran cold. Well, with that, Tom said, "Grab a leg, we're getting the hell out of here." The biggest deer I'd ever seen now felt like it weighed nothing as we pushed our way through the thick brush. It was like the trees and vines were no longer there as we moved. We were jumping over the fence when we heard the growl again. I ran to the truck, grabbed my rifle, and loaded it as fast as I could. I flipped on the truck's headlights, and we both scanned the woods, waiting for whatever it was to show itself. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes when we heard it again. This time, though, it sounded like it was further away. That's when Tom said, "Now's our chance to get that deer in the back of this truck and get out of here." We loaded that deer as fast as we could, jumped into the truck, and sped off that lease like there was no tomorrow. We didn't speak a word on the way back to Tom's house, just complete eerie silence. When we pulled into Tom's yard, he said, "You know, you need to take me back there tomorrow to get my truck." We just stared at each other. Tom grew up in this area and was a hunting guide who spent most of his life in the woods. As he talked about what happened, he said he had never heard anything remotely similar to that sound. We were both shaken up. Didn't know what to think, what to believe. The next morning, we waited until daylight to go fetch his truck. When we pulled up to the spot, the sun was out now, and it was a beautiful morning. Tom's truck covered in snow. He started it up, letting it run while I helped him brush off the snow. That's when we noticed it, the huge scratches on the hood of the truck. 5 giant long claw marks, as if something had tried to get inside. Tom stood frozen, staring at the marks. The claw marks ran from the center of the hood to the side. Side by each, the metal had caved in from the pressure of the claws, and in a few spots it was even ripped where the claws had gone through the hood. We both got in the truck and got the hell out of there, thankful we were still alive to tell the story, and wondered what really happened that night. What was out there? What was that thing? We did not know. We never spoke of it very often, as it was too frightening to remember. That story, well, it just became another part of Baxter's Mountains history. We never figured out what made those claw marks on Tom's truck or that terrifying growl. But this much is for sure. We never went back on that mountain again. And when I was asked to go to the lease for work, I outright refused. To this day, we have no idea what it was that night. But we are also thankful that we never found out what it was either. Don't let this terrifying true story end here. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because you never know what's lurking in the shadows of our next true story here at Paranormal Terrors. And if you have your own eerie experiences to share, send them to us. Your true story might be the next one we tell.